Today I will tell you a story from Arizona in the year 1883, a land where the desert winds never rest and law often belongs only to the strongest. It is the story of a proud young woman who collapsed after days of struggling alone against unforgiving land, and a rider of mixed Apache and white blood who spoke of a fateful promise. Let me shoulder this with you. But behind those words lay more than simple rescue. It was the beginning of a fight for survival. Long-buried secrets rising to the surface and a love tested in fire and blood. The sun lay heavy over the San Pedro Valley, that August afternoon, its weight pressing against earth and skin alike. Heat shimmered above the pale grass and thornbrush, the kind of heat that seemed to leach the strength from a person and leave only stubborn will behind. Selene Marlowe's hands were raw, the blisters torn open, blood seeping into the splintered haft of her hammer. Still she raised it again, teeth clenched, and drove another fence post into the hard, unyielding ground. The north line had to hold. Beyond the half-mended stretch of wire, her prized broodmare Starfur tossed her head sides rounded with the foal she carried. Not far off, the black stallion, Iron Comet, pawed the dust restless. If they slipped through before the gap was closed, they could be lost to the arroyo, or worse, driven off by the rustlers who'd been seen along the washes. Selene could not allow that. These horses were all she had left of her father's legacy, and they were her one chance at keeping the ranch alive past the coming winter. But her strength was failing. The survey stakes of the Southern and Meridian Railroad gleamed cruelly in the distance, pounded into her land without her consent. The banker in town had smiled politely, reminding her of the debt that hung like a noose. Neighbors had whispered she wouldn't last the year. And now, with each hammer blow, her arms shook harder, the edges of her vision dimming. A low thunder growled across the desert. Dark clouds swelled to the south, rolling in like cavalry. Selene braced herself, lifted the hammer again. Then the handle slipped against her torn palms. The iron head dropped into the dust. She staggered, tried to reach for it, but her knees buckled. The world pitched sideways, and the last thing she saw was Starfire's ears flicking nervously before blackness claimed her. Nokoni Hale had been riding the ridgeline all afternoon, following the faint scuff of horseshoes he knew did not belong to Selene Marlowe. The rustlers had grown bold lately, slipping along the edges of ranch land, testing fences. He read their sign like scripture, the length of a stride, the drag of a heel, the impatience of a mount held too tight. From the ridge, he had glimpsed a lone figure swinging a hammer where the wire sagged. He had recognized the Marlowe girl, stubborn as the dust itself. Folks in town said she'd never manage alone, that the bank would have her land before spring. Still, there was something in the rhythm of her work that made him pause, fierce, determined, as if she could hold back the entire desert with her two hands. Then he saw her fall. He spurred his paint gelding down the slope, dismounted before the horse stopped moving. She lay crumpled in the dirt, face pale beneath the scatter of freckles, chestnut hair clinging damp to her cheek. For a heartbeat, Ronan's chest tightened with a memory he did not want: other faces, other ashes. He pushed it down. He crouched, lifted her gently onto his knee, shaded her face with his hat. Her pulse beat faint but steady beneath his calloused fingers. He pulled his canteen-tipped a measure of salted water past her lips. She stirred, lashes fluttering, eyes the clear blue of desert wildflowers in spring. "This is my fence," she whispered, voice ragged. Her hand twitched toward the fallen hammer. Ronan's voice came low, steady. "Then let me shoulder this with you." She blinked at him, uncomprehending, and the faintest crease of resistance tugged her brow before exhaustion closed her eyes again. He carried her to the shadow of a mesquite, set her gently against the trunk, bound her torn palms with a strip torn from his own sleeve. When her breathing evened, he rose, gathered the hammer, and finished the work she had begun. His strokes were swift, practiced wood, driven deep wire, drawn taut. Knots tied clean, lightning flickered, far-off thunder answering with the promise of a storm to come. By the time Selene stirred again, the gap was closed, the horses penned safe. Ronan stood by the last post driving the final staple, his dark hair clinging damp against his temples. He looked up, once met her eyes across the distance. She swallowed the words rising in her throat, pride and gratitude wrestling inside her. She pushed herself to her feet, unsteady, brushed at her skirt with trembling hands. Before she could speak, he tipped his hat in a wordless gesture, mounted his horse, and rode a short circle to check the line again. Only then did he glance back, his expression unreadable, and angle away toward the ridge. Selene pressed her bandaged hands against her middle, breathing through the ache. The words he had spoken lingered heavier than the storm on the horizon. "Let me shoulder this with you." No one had ever offered such a thing. Not neighbors, not the banker, not even her father in his final days. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. High on the ridge above, two mounted figures sat watching. Their faces were shadowed by the low sun, their coats dark with dust. One leaned forward, spat into the dirt. "Half-breed's got himself a ranch today," he muttered. The other gave a dry laugh. "Then the banker won't like it one bit." They wheeled their horses and started back toward town, the sound of their departure lost beneath the rising growl of the storm. And below, in the settling dusk, Selene Marlowe stood by the mended fence, the thunder closing in and around her, not knowing that her life had just shifted on its axis because a man, half of two worlds, had spoken a promise he intended to keep. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us keep bringing these timeless, Wild West stories back to life, tales of courage, love, and resilience that should never be forgotten. By morning, the storm had rolled itself into memory. The ground was still damp, the desert's usual dust pressed flat, and the air smelled faintly of mesquite and rain. Selene's hands ached as she wrapped clean cloth over her palms. The hammer blisters had torn deeper than she first realized, and it shamed her that Nokoni Hale had seen her collapse like some fainting girl from the east. She stepped out onto the yard, determined to reclaim her pride. There by the north gate, Ronan was already at work mending the latch with an ease that spoke of long practice. He had removed his vest in the growing heat, his shoulders, broad muscles working smoothly as he adjusted the hinge pin. He moved as if the ranch were his own, without asking leave. "I can manage that," Selene called, her voice sharper than intended. Ronan glanced over his shoulder, calm. It needed doing. He tested the hinge, satisfied with the clean swing of the gate. "Won't hold long unless you get new iron. But this will serve through winter." She tightened her shawl around her shoulders, annoyed by the tremor in her voice. "You've already done more than enough. I owe you payment." He shook his head, straightened to his full height. "Don't want coin." "What then?" she demanded. For the first time, his eyes met hers without shadow. "First foal come spring, from the stallion and the mare you guard so close." Her breath caught. That was no small ask. Starfire's foal would be worth a fortune if the bloodline held true. But she saw in his face no greed, only a kind of steady patience. Still, her pride balked. "That's bold, Mr. Hale." "Fair," he said simply. Then he added softer, "And better than seeing you break yourself." She looked away to the fence line he had repaired in the storm. Her heart warred with reason, but in the end, she nodded once. "Very well. First foal. That's the bargain." His mouth tipped into the faintest curve, something like a smile, though it faded quickly. Then it settled. He gathered his horse and left before she could think of more to say. By late afternoon, Ruthie Doyle returned from town with the week's salt and coffee, tied in her burlap sack. Her hair, always escaping from its braid, tumbled around her face as she hurried into the yard. "They're saying in town," she blurted, catching her breath, that Banker Pritchard means to call your loan, Miss Selene. Claims there's questions about your property lines. Now the railroads come through. Selene stiffened. Questions. And Sheriff Pike, he's telling folks your north fence blocks a public road. Says you'll have to cut it open, or he'll order it done. Selene's blood chilled. That road had been nothing but a cattle track in her father's time. But Pike had always been a coward, willing to wear another man's chain. 2 days later, Selene rode into town with Ruthie at her side. The boardwalk creaked beneath her boots as she tied her mire outside the bank. Horace Pritchard emerged with his polished hat and his soft voice. His mustache curled upward, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Miss Marlowe," he said warmly, too warmly, "I've been concerned for you. These are trying times for a young lady alone. I would hate to see you overburdened." "I manage," Selene said coldly. "Indeed. But debts are heavy things. If you'd care to relieve yourself of such strain, I'd be happy to take the ranch off your hands. At a generous figure given the circumstances." "Generous for you," perhaps she returned, keeping her voice level. Behind him, Levi Carr, the railroad man in his immaculate suit, observed without speaking. His gaze measured everything, the sag of the roofline, the determination in her voice. Selene felt the weight of it and despised him for it. Across the street, Owen McCrae, the blacksmith with his limp, gave her a small nod. He said nothing, but his eyes carried quiet support. It was the only kindness she felt in that moment. That evening back at the ranch, Ronan returned with coils of wire slung across his saddle. He worked beside Selene at the corral until the sun bled red against the western sky. While tying off the last post, he showed her a knot she had never seen swift sure, holding tight without slack. She watched carefully, tried it, and when her fingers stumbled, he guided them with his own. Their hands touched briefly, rough skin against blistered palm, and the knot cinched perfect. Selene allowed herself the smallest smile. Useful trick. His eyes softened only for a heartbeat. "There are many, if you're willing to learn." For the first time since her father's death, she felt the faint stirring of trust. It startled her more than she let on. Night fell quiet. The sky deepened to indigo stars pricking the horizon. Selene checked the south meadow before retiring, lantern swinging in her hand. Starfire grazed peacefully, Iron Comet pacing the fence with restless energy. Uthre. She drew comfort from their presence, from the certainty that they were safe. But the illusion shattered with the dawn. A scream of splintering wood and the frantic neigh of Starfire dragged Selene from her bed. She ran barefoot into the yard, lantern flames sputtering in the wind. The south fence hung loose wire, cut clean in 2 places. Starfire reared, eyes rolling, her swollen sides heaving in terror. Selene seized the mare's halter, whispering soothing words, her own pulse hammering. Whoever had done this knew exactly where to strike. When Starfire calmed enough to be led back to the stall, Selene bent to the grass where the wire had been cut. There, half buried in the dirt, gleamed a silver cufflink. She lifted it into the lantern light, her breath freezing in her chest. Engraved upon it were 2 letters, L.C. Levi Carr. The railroad's hand had just reached straight into her pasture, and the fight for her father's land had truly begun. The morning after Starfire's panic, Ronan Hale walked the south meadow in silence. Selene followed at a distance, watching the way he read the ground as if it spoke a language only he understood. He crouched often, fingertips brushing the dirt, eyes narrowing. "Not coyotes," he murmured half to himself. "Not rustlers either. Not the common kind." Selene came closer. "How can you tell?" He pointed to the deep groove of iron wheels pressed into the soft earth. Square nails in the wheel rims. Railroad freight wagons used them. Came through in the night. He traced a second set of marks, a boot heel with brass tacks in the sole. "And here, deputy issue. Sheriff Pike's men." Selene's stomach turned. So it wasn't just shadows on the ridge. The law itself walked hand in hand with the railroad. By noon, her suspicions gained flesh. Levi Carr arrived at the ranch, his polished boots unsullied by the dust, his mustache trimmed with precision. He removed his gloves, as if entering a parlor, instead of a yard full of mud and sweat. "Miss Marlowe," he said smoothly, "I regret the intrusion, but I bring matters of legal importance." He produced a folded document, on thick cream paper edges pressed crisp. With a flourish, he spread it across the rough boards of the fence rail. "A right-of-way option," he explained, "signed by your late father. Grants the Southern and Meridian Railroad access across a section of your property, including," he tapped the clause with a well-manicured nail, "Marlowe Spring." Selene's breath caught. The spring was her lifeline. Without it, the horses would not last a summer. "My father never signed such a thing," she said firmly. Carr's smile never wavered. "His signature appears here, does it not?" It did, the sweeping hand, the strong J of Jonathan Marlowe. Selene's chest tightened. It looked real. Too real. Carr lowered his voice, oily smooth. "If you refuse, the bank will have no choice but to foreclose. You are already in arrears, are you not? If you sign, you retain your home, though at a smaller scope. Think carefully, Miss Marlowe. Time is not your ally." Selene pressed her fingers against the rail, willing her voice steady. "I will not be rushed. A decision this grave deserves witness. The Reverend will look it over before I sign anything." Carr's eyes flickered, but he bowed gracefully. "As you wish. Do not tarry over long." He replaced his gloves and strode back toward town, leaving the document in her hands like a coiled snake. That evening, she and Ronan worked side by side at the corral. He did not ask about the paper, though she felt the question in his silence. They drove posts in rhythm, her swinging the mallet, him steadying the line. For a fleeting moment, they moved as if they had done so all their lives together. When the work paused, he showed her another knot, this one quick to release in case of stampede. She fumbled once, then managed it, earning a nod from him. "Every fence tells a story," he said quietly. "Who built it? Who broke it? Who held fast?" Selene looked at him then, and for the first time felt something like strength flow back into her, because she wasn't standing entirely alone. Meanwhile in town, Ruthie Doyle lingered at the Mercantile longer than usual, pretending to eye bolts of cloth she couldn't afford. Behind the half-open door to the back office, she heard voices low-heated. The trust was never meant to see daylight came. Horace Pritchard's clipped tone. "If it surfaces," Pike hissed, "you'll hang with it. I want my cut clean." Ruthie pressed closer, heart hammering. She caught only fragments, funds diverted. Relief. "Marlowe, for H." She slipped out unseen, resolved to tell Selene at once. By week's end, Reverend Amos Thorne summoned Selene to the parsonage. His hands shook slightly as he drew a small tin from the bottom of a ledger drawer. The metal was dented, but on its lid, in her father's steady script, were the words, "For H. Your father gave this to me. Before he passed," the Reverend explained. "Told me to keep it until the time came. I believe that time is now." Selene traced the letters with her thumb, unease settling heavy in her chest. She did not open it yet, not with so many eyes upon her. But the weight of secrets pressed harder with every passing day. That night, the desert sky grew swollen and strange. The monsoon clouds gathered with alarming speed, black walls rolling over the valley. The air smelled of iron and rain. Ronan lifted his head to the wind, reading the storm the way Selene's father once had. "Flash flood," he said grimly. "The wash will take the South Corral if we don't clear the sluice." Even as he spoke, lightning split the horizon. Thunder crashed so loud, the horses screamed in their stalls. Selene grabbed for her coat, but her hands trembled around the lantern. Together they ran into the storm. The first sheets of rain lashed against them, drumming the earth into mud. In the distance, the roar of water surged like an approaching army. And as Selene saw the rising torrent bearing down on her land, she knew this was no ordinary storm. This was sabotage, written in floodwater, and if they failed to act, the Marlowe ranch would be swept away before dawn. The storm broke over the San Pedro Valley with the fury of a cavalry charge. Rain sheeted down so hard it stung the skin, thunder rattled the bones of the earth, and the arroyos howled as floodwater rushed through them like unleashed beasts. Selene and Ronan fought their way toward the sluice gate lantern light, flaring wildly in the gale. Water pooled across the yard, streaming toward the south corral, where Starfire and Iron Comet kicked and screamed in their stalls. The sluice, Ronan shouted over the roar. It's blocked. They rounded the corner and saw the truth of it, a heavy branch, wedged tight across the gate, wound through with wire. Not nature's work, someone had fixed it there, intent on drowning her pasture. Selene grabbed the lantern closer, heart hammering. They set this. Ronan's eyes narrowed, rain sluicing down his face. Car's men. No doubt. He threw his shoulder against the branch, muscles straining, while Selene pulled at the wire with bleeding hands. The water climbed higher, swirling around their knees, dragging at their footing. Lightning slashed across the sky, dazzling the night with a blue-white glare. With a sudden crack, the branch gave way, but not before it wrenched sideways. A jagged splinter tore across Ronan's shoulder, ripping his shirt and gouging deep. He staggered, teeth clenched against the pain, but forced the sluice open. The pent-up water surged free, roaring into the lower wash, sparing the corral by inches. Selene caught his arm. You're hurt. Later, he growled, but the blood darkening through the rain said otherwise. They stumbled back to the barn, soaked to the bone. Inside, the smell of wet hay and frightened horses filled the close air. Starfire pressed against her stall boards, eyes rolling, while Iron Comet pawed furiously, nostrils flaring at every thunderclap. Selene set the lantern on a beam and guided Ronan to a bench. The cut on his shoulder was bad, long and deep, still bleeding through the fabric. With hands steadier than she felt, she tore strips from a feed sack, cleaned the wound with water, and bound it tight. Ronan sat still beneath her touch, eyes lowered, his breath harsh. The storm's fury outside made the moment strangely intimate. The world reduced to two people and a row of horses, the lamplight throwing their shadows tall against the rafters. You should have let me handle the wire, Selene said softly. You'd have been swept under. His voice was quiet but firm. Better my shoulder than your life. Her hands paused against the bandage. Gratitude and fear tangled in her chest, leaving her unable to speak for a long moment. At last he stirred. You asked why I carry myself apart, he said. His gaze was distant, somewhere beyond the barn walls. When I was a boy, my mother's camp was set upon by cavalry. I remember fire screams, smoke thick enough to choke the sky. Men cut us down like brush. I would have died there too. Selene listened, breath caught. But one man, a soldier, an officer, pulled me from the flames. I remember the sword he carried bright in the firelight. A cavalry sliver. He lifted me onto his horse, pressed a canteen to my lips, and told me to ride until I found safety. I never saw him again. Ronan's jaw tightened. Since then, I've lived by one measure. I owe a debt. To him. To that moment. Selene's hand went instinctively to the chain around her neck. From it hung the iron key her father had carried all his life, the key to the chest where he kept his military papers. She felt its cold weight, and wondered with a sudden pang if the nameless officer Ronan spoke of had been Jonathan Marlowe. Her throat tightened. Perhaps he saved you for a reason. Ronan met her eyes, rain-dark hair falling loose around his face. Perhaps. For a heartbeat, the storm faded, and the barn was only silence and the warmth of their breath. Dawn came gray and sodden, the world scoured clean but heavy with mud. Selene had barely closed her eyes when the crunch of hoofs on wet earth jolted her awake. Outside, Sheriff Harlan Pike rode up the yard, oilskin coat dripping, his badge glinting against the gloom. Behind him, 2 deputies waited in silence, hands near their gun belts. Selene stepped out to meet him, chin high, despite the fatigue weighing her down. "Morning, Miss Marlowe." Pike, drawled voice slick as oil. "Quite a blow last night. Hope you fared well enough." Her jaw clenched. "We managed. Good. He swung down from the saddle boots sinking into the mud. "I come on official business. By order of the county and the Southern and Meridian Railroad, you are to vacate within 30 days. Your fence line blocks a public road, and your loan's overdue besides." Selene's face burned, but before she could speak, Ronan stepped from the barn, his shirt torn at the shoulder, bandage visible beneath. Pike's gaze snapped to him, and his smile curled cruel. "Well, I'll be damned. Miss Marlowe's taken in help. Or is it more than that?" His tone turned venomous. "Didn't figure you for the type to keep company with half-breeds." The words hung in the damp air, heavy and deliberate. Selene felt the blood drain from her face, rage sparking behind her ribs. But Ronan only stood still, rain dripping from his hair, eyes steady as stone. He did not flinch, did not rise to the bait. And somehow his silence cut sharper than any retort. The morning after Pike's threat, Selene sat at her kitchen table, the storm's damp chill still clinging to the air. Her father's worn Bible lay before her, the leather cracked, the pages yellowed from years of dust and sweat. She had carried it since his death, too afraid of what it might say, to open the pressed envelope tucked deep inside. Now, with Ronan outside tending the restless horses, she finally drew it out. Her father's handwriting curved across the paper in a firm hand, though the ink trembled toward the end. "To my daughter Selene," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone. There are debts on my conscience heavier than any banknote. I did things as a soldier I cannot justify before God, and I have no right to ask forgiveness. But I tried in my last years to mend what could be mended." Her hands shook as she read further. "I kept aside funds in trust to support for TNH, a boy I once pulled from fire and left to fend for himself. It is a small reparation for sins too large. You will find the record with Reverend Thorne. I pray you will understand why I kept this hidden. I was not the man I should have been, but I hope I saved at least one soul from the ruin I helped bring." The page blurred as Selene pressed her fist to her mouth. NH. There was no mistaking who her father meant. Ronan Hale. Later that same day, Reverend Amos Thorne met her in the church's back room. He set a dented tin box on the desk between them. "This is what your father left with me. Said it might one day protect the ranch if the right time came." Selene's breath quickened as she turned the key that had hung around her neck since childhood. The lock gave with a soft click, the lid creaking open. Inside lay a sheaf of papers, deeds, receipts, and on top a folded legal document stamped with the seal of the territorial court. Her eyes caught the bold header, Addendum of Revocation. It was signed, witnessed, and dated. A supplement that canceled the supposed right-of-way her father had been accused of granting. The document Carr had pressed upon her was worthless if this revocation was honored. For the first time in months, hope flickered in Selene's chest. She rode into town the next morning, her hair damp from the lingering mist, Ruthie at her side. When she mounted the boardwalk, townsfolk paused in their errands, whispers following her. Selene stepped straight into the bank, the paper held firm in her hand. Carr was there as though he had expected her, lounging in a chair by the stove. His eyes sharpened when she laid the revocation on the counter. "This was filed through the court," she said, her voice ringing clear. "Your contract is void. The spring remains Marlowe property." Carr's smile faltered, the first gag in his smooth mask. His gaze darted to Pritchard, who stood stiff behind the counter. The banker recovered quickly, lips curling into a smile too polished. So be it. The railroad may not claim the water, but the bank still holds your debt. And debts must be settled, Miss Marlowe. Unless you'd rather deed us the land entire at fair market value. The shift in tactic was plain as daylight. Cut off the railroad's claim, and Pritchard bared his own teeth. Back at the ranch, Ronan listened as Selene told him of her father's letter. His face was stone, but the lines around his mouth tightened with every word. A boy pulled from fire. He repeated, his voice rough. A cavalry officer with a saber in his hand. He rose abruptly, pacing the packed earth floor of the barn. It was him. Your father. His breath came sharp. All these years I carried the memory like a brand, owing my life to a ghost. And it was him. The man whose blood runs in your veins. Selene reached for him, but he pulled away, torn between gratitude and fury. I've lived by the code of that night, but to discover it ties me to you. He shook his head, dark hair clinging damp against his brow. I cannot stay. Ronan, she whispered, fear breaking through her pride. You said you owed a debt. That doesn't mean you must walk away. He didn't answer, only turned toward the stall, where Iron Comet pawed the dirt restless. His silence weighed heavier than any words. The break came swiftly. That evening, Ruthie failed to return from her errands in town. When Selene asked after her, no one claimed to have seen the girl past sundown. Dread curdled in Selene's stomach. The answer arrived on the smoke that drifted into the night sky. From the freight yard, Ronan was the first to see it. He leapt into the saddle, Selene clinging behind him, and they thundered toward town. The warehouse by the tracks was ablaze, flames licking high into the darkness. Townsfolk gathered in murmurs, but no one dared approach. Selene's heart twisted as she spotted a bundle of ledgers and papers hurled from the doorway, catching fire before her eyes. The bank's records, Ronan said grimly. Evidence burned clean. A muffled cry cut through the roar of the flames. Selene froze. Ruthie. Ronan was already moving, pulling his bandaged shoulder against the door. Selene scrambled after him, choking on smoke. Together they battered down the lock, the heat driving them back. For a split second, Selene glimpsed Ruthie tied to a post inside her face, streaked with soot, eyes wide with terror. Hands dragged her back. As the roof began to collapse, beams tumbling in showers of sparks. The night closed around Selene in chaos fire, consuming the only proof of Pritchard's corruption. Ruthie's scream echoing, Ronan vanishing into the inferno without hesitation. And she knew then that the fight for her ranch was no longer just a battle of papers. It had turned into a war, waged in blood and fire. The roar of the warehouse blaze devoured every other sound, the crack of splitting beams, the hiss of falling cinders, the pounding of Selene's own heart. Smoke clawed down her throat as she stumbled into the choking heat beside Ronan. Take her arms, he barked, already cutting Ruthie loose with his knife. The girl sagged into Selene's embrace, coughing, her soot-streaked face pressed into Selene's shoulder. Ronan slung her up as if she weighed nothing. Go now, Selene staggered after him, shielding her eyes against the sparks. The three of them burst into the night, just as the roof caved in behind them, with a scream of iron and fire. The crowd gasped, the flames leaping higher, sparks scattering across the dark like 1,000 fireflies. Ruthie sobbed against Selene's chest, gasping for air. They locked me in. Said it would all burn everything. Ronan bent, pulled half-charred ledgers from beneath a fallen crate. The covers were blackened, but inside pages still clung together, columns of numbers, entries marked with Pritchard's neat hand. The ink was smeared, but enough remained to show the pattern. Money withdrawn from a trust that should never have been touched. Funds marked relief for veterans disappearing into loans never repaid. Proof, Ronan said grimly. Proof he's been stealing for years. But the triumph was short-lived. Boots clattered across the boardwalk. Sheriff Pike pushed through the gawking crowd, Deputies at his seat, his badge glinting in the firelight. "There's your culprit," Pike snarled, pointing at Ronan. "Caught red-handed with the blaze still on him. Arrest him for arson." Selene spun, fury flashing. "That's a lie. He saved Ruthie's life. He saved us all." Pike ignored her, his gaze fixed on Ronan with thinly veiled contempt. Deputies seized Ronan's arms, wrenching them behind his back, despite his injured shoulder. He did not resist, though his eyes blazed with the same stormfire that had lit the night before. The next morning, Pritchard arrived at the ranch, boots spotless, despite the mud smile polished as glass. He let himself into Selene's yard with the ease of a man who believed everything within reach belonged to him. "I'll be plain, Miss Marlowe," he said smoothly. "Your companion is facing a rope, but it doesn't have to be so. One signature on this deed," he tapped the papers he carried, "and I can make all this unpleasantness disappear. The bank will forgive your arrears. Your land will be secure under new stewardship, and Hale will walk free." Selene stared at him, her stomach twisting. "You'd trade a man's life for my ranch." He spread his hands, mock gracious. "Let us call it a fair exchange. You gain security. He gains his neck. Everyone wins." Her voice was cold as steel. "Not if it means surrendering everything my father built. Not if it means bowing to your corruption." His smile thinned, hardening into menace. "Think carefully. Nobility is poor company when you're alone, Miss Marlowe." But Selene only lifted her chin, her eyes fierce. "Better alone than chained to men like you." Pritchard's gaze darkened. "So be it. Then pray for your half-breed soul." He tipped his hat, leaving the papers on her porch like a curse. That evening, Reverend Amos Thorne arrived at Selene's door, his hands trembling as he carried a slim ledger bound in cracked leather. "I went back through the bank's records," he said, voice shaking. "Hidden deep under false accounts, I found this." The seal of the bank remained unbroken on the final page. Inside were entries untouched by the fire amounts, siphoned from the relief trust, diverted into Pritchard's own coffers. It was enough to hang him 10 times over. Selene clutched the book to her chest, hope mingling with dread. But Ronan's life was already balanced on the edge of a blade. In the freight yard at dawn, a grim crowd gathered. Pike's deputies had hauled Ronan out, wrists bound, shirt bloodied at the shoulder. They pushed him against a post, rifles leveled, while the sheriff read a charge of arson in a voice oily with false solemnity. Selene forced her way through the crowd, Ruthie clinging to her skirts, shouting, "He's innocent." You all know it, but her words were drowned by Pike's barked order. "Take aim." The rifles lifted. The air grew taut as a drawn wire. Then a gunshot split the morning, but it came not from the firing line. One of the deputy's rifles flew from his grip, knocked clean by a slug from across the square. All heads turned to see Owen McCrae, the lame blacksmith, standing braced on his bad leg, smoke curling from the barrel of his revolver. "You'll not murder a man on false charges," Owen said, his voice ringing like iron, struck on the anvil. "Not while I draw breath." Chaos erupted. The townsfolk surged, some shouting for justice, others backing away in fear. In the confused fusion, Owen hobbled forward, swinging his hammer to drive back Pike's men. The bond of steel between him and Ronan was wordless, but fierce. Ronan seized the moment, shouldering aside one guard, breaking another's grip with brutal precision. Bullets hissed wild into the air as Selene pulled Ruthie clear. When the smoke cleared, Ronan stood free, Owen at his side, Pike cursing as he scrambled for cover. Selene's heart thundered with both terror and relief. They had escaped the noose, but the cost was war declared. The morning sun poured pale light across the San Pedro Valley, gilding the wet grass from the storm. But no peace lingered. Dust rose on the horizon, too much for cattle, too swift for ranch work. A column of riders came down the ridge, hard men with rifles across their saddles. At their head rode Horace Pritchard, stiff in his banker's coat, and Levi Carr, gleaming like a knife in the sun. They were coming for the spring. Word spread quickly. By the time the riders reached the Marlowe ranch, townsfolk had gathered, drawn by whispers of foreclosure and law. Men stood with arms crossed, women with baskets clutched tight. Children peeked from behind skirts. No one spoke at first, but the air crackled with unease. Selene stood tall at the gate, Ruthie and Owen behind her, the Reverend and Martha among the crowd. The old Bible pressed against her chest, the tin box under her arm. She looked like a figure carved from the land itself, worn proud, unyielding. Carr dismounted with a flourish, spreading his hands as though addressing a polite assembly. Ladies and gentlemen, this ranch is no longer in lawful possession. The Southern and Meridian Railroad holds the deed signed by the late Captain Marlowe himself. Today we claim what is ours by right. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Selene stepped forward, her voice ringing clear. You speak of rights, Mr. Carr. Let me answer with the truth. She drew out the stamped paper from the tin, held it aloft for all to see. This is the revocation signed by my father after he discovered your fraud. It cancels every claim you hold. Carr's smile sharpened. Forgery, most likely. A desperate woman's trick. But Selene's eyes blazed. Then hear the rest. She lifted the half-burned ledger saved from the fire pages, fluttering in the breeze. Here are withdrawals marked with Horace Pritchard's hand. Funds stolen from Veterans Relief. Not a cent ever reached those families. Gasps rose from the crowd. Men glanced at one another, faces tightening with shame and anger. Pritchard flushed scarlet sweat, beating under his collar. This is slander, he barked. She lies. A shout cut him off. From the north slope came the thunder of hooves. Nokoni Hale rode down astride Iron Comet, the black stallion gleaming like midnight fire. In his hand he bore not a rifle, but a cavalry saber, its steel catching the sun. The very weapon Selene's father once carried, now wielded by the man her father had saved. A murmur swept the crowd, half awe, half fear. Ronan reined in beside Selene, the sword lifted high. You come with papers bought in lies, he called to Carr and Pritchard, but justice is not written in fraud. It is written in blood and truth. And today it stands here. Carr sneered, signaling the hired guns. Drive them off. Rifles cracked. The yard erupted in chaos. Selene flung herself behind the corral rail, Ruthie screaming as bullets split the dust. Ronan wheeled Iron Comet, the saber flashing not to cut men down, but to strike rifles from grasping hands. He rode like a storm-given flesh, the stallion plunging and twisting beneath him. A shot caught his side, spinning him half out of the saddle. He gritted his teeth, clinging, refusing to fall. Selene's heart lurched, but he lifted his head again, eyes hard as flint. He would not yield. She raised her father's revolver, aiming steady, despite the tremor in her hands. Sheriff Pike advanced through the smoke badge, glinting gun leveled at Ronan's back. Selene squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck true, not his chest, but the star on his vest. The badge flew spinning into the dirt. Pike staggered back, his weapon falling useless from his grasp. The crowd erupted shouts, curses, the tide turning. Some townsfolk surged forward, knocking rifles askew, no longer willing to serve as silent witnesses. Then the church bell rang. Martha Thorne, her arms strong, despite the years, pulled the rope with all her weight. The peal echoed across the valley, rising over the din. And with it came a blizzard of paper. From the church steeple windows, Reverend Amos cast down page after page from the surviving ledger and the court revocation. Sheets fluttered on the wind, white against the blue sky, raining down into the hands of the townsfolk. Men snatched them up, reading aloud. Pritchard, withdrawal. $300 signed by him. Look here. The evidence fell like snow undeniable, scattering all pretense. Pritchard's face twisted, panic breaking through his polished mask. He tried to mount his horse, but Owen McCrae hobbled forward, hammer in hand, and struck the banker across the jaw with one clean blow. Pritchard crumpled, spitting blood in the dirt. Thief, Owen spat. "You'll answer for every coin you stole." Carr saw the tide turn. His charm shattered. He vaulted into the saddle, spurred hard, and fled toward the ridge. Bullets chased him, but the dust swallowed him whole. The gunfire ebbed, smoke drifting away on the breeze. Ronan slid from Iron Comet's back, clutching his bleeding side. Selene rushed to him, catching his weight as he sagged against her. "You're hurt," she whispered. He gave a faint smile, teeth stained red. "Not so bad. Worse things than bullets tried to take me once." Her hands pressed firm over the wound, but her eyes lifted fierce with pride. Around them, the townsfolk gathered, no longer silent, no longer blind. They looked upon Pritchard bound in the dirt, upon the pages still drifting from the steeple, and new truth had been written for all to see. By sundown, the spring ran clear again, untouched by fraud or fire. Martha knelt in prayer. Owen stood with his hammer across his shoulder, and Ruthie leaned on Selene's arm, her eyes bright with relief. Ronan rested against the corral post, the saber of Jonathan Marlowe across his knees. He did not claim it as spoil, but held it with the solemnity of a man carrying both debt and redemption. Selene looked upon him, then her heart certain. Whatever storms yet waited, whatever battles remained, they would face them side by side. For the spring was saved, the town awakened, and justice had rung out in the clash of steel the toll of the church bell, and the words of a man once lost to fire, who now carried light in his hands. The day after the battle, the air over the San Pedro Valley was quiet, hushed, as though the land itself needed to rest. The church bell, once pealing in alarm, hung still. Smoke from the burned warehouse had drifted away, leaving only the scent of rain on mesquite. Ronan lay on a cot inside the Thorne parsonage, his shoulder bound in Martha's careful bandages. He stirred, wincing, but found Selene seated beside him. Her hand rested lightly over his, her eyes, shadowed from days of strain, yet steady as the horizon itself. "You should sleep," she murmured. His voice was hoarse but certain. "Not while you're here." The faintest smile touched her lips. "Then you'll never sleep again." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the soft creak of the house and the steady rhythm of his breath. Outside, the town gathered at Reverend Amos's call. It was time for the truth. On the church steps, the Reverend unfolded the letter Selene had kept hidden, the final words of Jonathan Marlowe. His voice carried through the crowd. "I confess to sins done in war. I struck when I should have held back. I followed orders when I should have defied them. One life I spared, a boy named Ronan Hale. For him, I leave a trust, a small measure of what is owed. To my daughter I ask forgiveness. To God I beg mercy. May this land and these horses be guarded better than I guarded the souls in my charge." The words fell heavy yet cleansing like rain on dust. Faces in the crowd shifted, doubt yielding to recognition, suspicion softening into shame. Men who had once turned away from Ronan now looked upon him with something closer to respect. And when Selene lifted her chin, her voice carrying firm and clear, no one dared gainsay her. "This ranch stands, not by fraud nor by theft, but by work, by sacrifice, by truth. My father erred, but he did one thing right. He chose to save a life. That life is here beside me, and I will not see it dishonored." A murmur rose, not of dissent, but of assent. Slowly the town, Owen with his hammer, Martha with her steady eyes, even those who had once whispered, closed ranks behind her. At dusk, Selene walked with Ronan to the spring. The water shimmered in the fading light, as if holding the memory of all that had been fought for. In her hands, She carried the saber, its blade still bright, though scarred by time. She drove it point first into the earth, beside the water's edge. The steel shivered, catching the last sunbeam, before settling upright, a marker both grave and promise. Here, Selene said softly, the past lies buried. No more debts, no more shadows. Ronan's gaze lingered on the blade, then on her. The weight of years seemed to ease from his shoulders. He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers with deliberate care. When I found you at the fence, he said, voice low, I told you to let me shoulder it with you. She met his eyes, steady and luminous. And I told you then it was mine. But I was wrong. We'll shoulder it together. Always. His fingers closed around hers, strong and sure. For the first time since childhood, far he felt no need to stand apart. Spring came early that year. Starfire's foal, a colt with long legs and a white blaze, ran wild in the meadow at dawn. His leaps splashed dew into the air, his call answering the valley's waking birds. Along the fence line, Selene and Ronan rode side by side, the morning sun rising behind them. Their shadows stretched long across the grass, one shape alongside another, never parting. The land was not gentled. There would still be storms, debts, hard winters. But they had chosen. They had stood. And now at last they rode forward together, two souls bound by love and trial, as enduring as the land itself. And that is the story of Selene Marlowe and Ronan Hale, a proud woman and a rider of mixed blood who walked through fire, deceit and loss, only to find each other again beneath a new dawn. Personally, I believe the words, let me shoulder this with you, are more than just a promise of love. They are a reminder for life itself. We don't always have to carry the weight of the world alone. Sometimes having just one person willing to stand beside us, to share even half the burden, is enough to weather any storm.